This PowerPoint is on Chapter 5 for Info 1105. And in this chapter, we are going to create subtotals, pivot tables, and pivot charts. Basically, we're going to be summarizing and analyzing data. So, a little bit about subtotals and outlines before we go look at the tutorials. You have to remember that data alone is meaningless. So data translated into meaningful information increases your knowledge so that you can make informed decisions. So previously in the other chapters, you've used analytical tools like sorting, filtering, conditional formatting, tables, and charts. Now these help translate raw data into information so that you can identify trends, patterns, and anomalies in a data set. So what we're going to learn in this chapter, now that you're ready to explore other functionalities, it's going to help you analyze larger amounts of data. You're going to learn how to insert subtotals within a data set. Okay, then you're also going to learn how to group data to create an outline. You'll learn how to collapse and expand groups within the outline. And you also learn how to ungroup data to return them to their original state. So first, let's take a look at subtotaling data. So when a data set is sorted by categories, you can use the subtotals command to display a total for the columns containing values in each category. So the subtotal command inserts a subtotal row, which is a row that includes one or more aggregate functions. And it doesn't have to be total. It doesn't have to be just sum. It can also be average or values within each category within a data set. This command can save you time so that you don't have to actually manually insert a blank row for each category and then insert the function on each subtotal row. Okay, so let's look at subtotals. You can then compare the subtotals among the categories to then analyze the data. You can also collapse and expand the details without having to manually hide and unhide individual rows. So this is a quick way to collapse and expand based on the categories. Okay, so it will look something like this here. This is your outline. Okay, so when the outline is created, you'll have these on the side. So what you see here, the plus sign, you can click on it to expand each area to show more of its details. And up here, you can click this 1, 2, 3 symbols to show categories, subtotals, or grand total. I believe 1 will show the grand total, and 2 will show the subtotals, and 3 is all the details. Okay, and oh right, so here we have the symbol. So 1 collapses outline to display the grand total only, so it hides everything else, just shows the grand total. 2 here, I know it's hard to see, displays the subtotals by the main subtotal category, the grand total. And 3 just shows the entire list. So the plus sign expands a list and, expands a group to see its details, and the minus sign collapses an outline group to see its category name only. Now this is also shown in the video tutorial. Okay, so next we'll look at grouping and ungrouping data. The subtotals command outlines data into categories by rows. You can create outlines by columns of related data as well. So for Excel to outline by columns, a data set must contain columns with formulas or aggregate functions. If for some reason Excel cannot create the outline, then it will show you the message, cannot create an outline. Okay, this slide is on collapsing and expanding. So when a data set has been grouped into an outline, you can collapse the outline data to show only the main rows like the subtitles, or you can expand the outline data to show all the details. So at this point, I would like you to go and watch the video tutorials. You can pause this PowerPoint video here and then refer to your video tutorials folder, and in there please watch your first video tutorial, and then when you're done that, you can come back to this PowerPoint. Next, we are going to look at pivot table basics. So pivot table has to do with analyzing large amounts of data. It's important for making solid business decisions. So entering data is the easy part. Retrieving it in a structured, meaningful way can be more challenging. So then we look at things like data mining. And data mining is a process of analyzing large volumes of data using advanced statistical techniques and identifying trends and patterns in the data. So managers use data mining techniques to address a variety of questions. So the examples given to you in the textbook is, what snack foods do customers purchase most when purchasing Pepsi products, or which age group from which geographic region downloads the most top 10 songs from iTunes, or which hotel chain or rental car combinations are most popular amongst Delta Airlines passengers flying to Salt Lake City. So usually we're trying to find relationships between different categories of data. And it's very useful in the world of marketing. So questions like these can help organizations prepare their marketing plans to capitalize on consumer spending patterns. And this is just one of the many uses for data mining. Anyway, the more you know about your customer demographics, the better then you can focus your strategic business plans to increase market share. So this is where pivot table comes in handy. A pivot table is an interactive table that uses calculations to consolidate and summarize data from a data source into a separate table. So pivot tables let you analyze data in a data set without altering the data set itself. Now, pivot tables are dynamic. You can easily and quickly rearrange data to analyze data from very different viewpoints. You can have different perspectives on the same data with, just clicking a few things. So looking at the data from different perspectives can help you identify trends and patterns amongst the different variables that might not be so obvious when you're just looking at, hundreds of rows of data manually by yourself. All right, so in this section, you're going to learn how to organize and group data into rows and columns, remove and rearrange fields, change the settings for value fields. Now, before you create a pivot table, make sure that the data source is well structured, and good rules for a good table design has been applied. So a few of these things are using meaningful column labels, ensuring data accuracy, avoiding blank rows and columns in the data set, making sure that at least one column must have duplicate values, such as the same discipline or area name for several records, to create categories for organizing and summarizing data. Another column must also have numeric values that can be aggregated to produce quantitative summaries like averages or sums. So pivot tables are similar to subtotals because they both produce subtotals, but pivot tables do more. They provide more flexibility than just subtotals. If you need complex subtotals cross-referenced by two or more categories with filtering and other specifications, create a pivot table. Using the subtotals command inserts subtotal rows within the data set, while pivot table does not change the data set. So the pivot table draws the information from the data set, but it's separate from the data set. But the subtotal, when you insert the subtotals, it actually inserts the rows within the data set. So it does change the data set. All right, so how do we create pivot tables? You can use the quick analysis gallery. When you click on it, that option shows up. Or you can go to the Insert tab. In the Tables group, you can see the recommended pivot tables. Anyway, watch the video tutorial. So pause this PowerPoint video right now and go to your video tutorial on how to create pivot tables, and please watch that. When you're done that, please come back to this PowerPoint. All right, now that you have watched the video on how to create pivot tables, you would have seen the different areas of a pivot table. We have the filters area, we have the columns area, we have the rows area, and we have the values area. So I'm not going to read this whole table out to you. Please do so. This is also available to you in your textbook. Next, we also learned how to create a blank pivot table. So you can create a blank or an empty pivot table, so you can specify the data that you want to analyze and where you want the pivot table to be placed. So you're not restricted to a current data set within an Excel sheet, worksheet. You can specify an external data source, like data on a company's database server or data on a web page. You can place the pivot table on a new worksheet or on an existing worksheet. So please watch the video tutorial, pause this slide right now, go to watch your video tutorial on creating a blank pivot table. And when you're done that, please come back to this video. Next, we are going to look at how to refresh a pivot table. So pivot tables are not automatically updated. If you make changes to the data in the data source, they draw the data from there and they create the table. But if you make a change in the original range of data, that change is not reflected. If you change a sales value or delete a row in the data source, the pivot table does not show this change data. So this causes the pivot table summary statistics to become obsolete, become outdated with inaccurate results. So please watch the video tutorial on how to refresh your pivot table. Please pause this PowerPoint video right now and refer to refreshing a pivot table video tutorial. Next, we'll look at data modeling and pivot charts. So when you created a pivot table earlier, you created it from a data set in a single worksheet. However, data is usually contained in multiple sources, such as multiple worksheets or databases. So you can actually also use related data to create a pivot table. So you can create a pivot table from multiple sources, not just from one range. We'll also learn about pivot charts. Pivot charts are visual representations of numerical data. So just like charts, pivot charts are created from pivot tables. Okay, before we had charts that are created from a range of data. Very similar thing, pivot charts help reveal trends or patterns in the data because people can often interpret visual aids easier than reviewing an entire data set. The graphs and the charts make more sense to the user, especially at a glance. Okay, so in this final section, we're going to learn how to select multiple data sets. We're going to learn how to create relationship between the data sets. We're going to create a pivot table, and we're going to create and format a pivot chart. So let's get started with creating a data model. So to analyze data contained in multiple tables, we use a data model. A data model is a collection of related tables that contain structured data used to create a database. You can create a relationship between two or more Excel tables that have some commonality and relationship. You can then perform more complex data analysis to make more informed decisions based on that. So the number one thing we're going to do here in our video tutorial is to create a relationship between tables. A relationship is an association or a connection between two tables where both tables contain at least one common field of data. For example, you might want to generate a report that contains sales representatives' names and their respective data. But that data is stored in one table, and then the representatives' names are stored in another table. So to combine the names and data into one report, you have to establish a link or a relationship between the two tables using the sales reps ID, which is contained in both the tables. So in the video tutorial, I show you how you can do this, create a relationship between the two tables. After you have created the relationship between the two tables, then you can create a pivot table from the related tables. So after you create this relationship, your next step is to create the pivot table from the two tables in which you have established a relationship. The fields from both tables are available from which to choose, and then this gives you more detailed analysis of the data. So when you go and create the pivot table, you can choose all the different fields from both the tables. This is both available for you. So I'd like you to pause here and go and watch the tutorial video in which I show you how you can create the pivot table after you have established the relationship between the two tables. And finally, we are going to look at creating a pivot chart. A pivot chart is an interactive graphical representation of the data in the pivot table. Okay, a pivot chart shows the consolidated data visually. When you change the position of a field in either the pivot table or the pivot chart, the corresponding object changes as well. So if you change the pivot table, anything in it, the pivot chart reflects that change. If you change something in the pivot chart, then the pivot table reflects that change. So I'd like you to pause this PowerPoint again here and then go and watch the tutorial video on how to create a pivot chart, please. So in this slide, we look at what a pivot chart looks like. Okay, so Excel creates a pivot chart based on the current pivot table settings like row labels, column labels, values, and filters. So the pivot chart contains elements that enable you to set the filters. Okay, so you can filter by date or filter by sales rep here. And over here, the columns area, what used to be the columns area, is now the legend series. And down here, what used to be the rows area is now the axis category. Next, we look at modifying the pivot chart. You can change the settings using the pivot chart fields list. You can click on the filters arrow and select the values to filter the chart. You can click on the axis category arrows to sort or filter the categories and subcategories in the rows. You can click on the legend series to filter the chart based on the value. So the changes you make to the pivot chart also, like I said, affect the corresponding pivot table. And in this slide, we look at the Pivot Chart Tools Analyze tab. So if you go to the Pivot Chart Tools Analyze tab, it will contain the same options that you used to customize a pivot table earlier in the chapter. You can enter the name in the chart name box in the pivot chart group. You can insert slicers or timelines. You can refresh the chart after changing the data source. I show you that in the video tutorial. You can also move the chart option in the actions group. This lets you move a pivot chart to a different worksheet if you need to. And finally, we look at the Pivot Chart Tools Design tab. So the Pivot Chart Tools Design tab contains all the similar options to the groups on the Chart Tools Design tab. Okay, so very similar to just a regular chart. You can change the chart layouts, you can customize the chart styles, the data, where you can switch how rows and columns of data is represented. You can change the chart type, and you can also change the location. And that is it for our video presentation. Make sure that you did go through all the video tutorials, and after you have done that, you're now ready to do the class exercises. After that, we have a class assignment for you and the class quiz. All right, so any questions, please do email me, and I will set up a Zoom meeting with you if we need to go over something together, or I can email you back if it's a short question.